June 3, 1847. Iberville Parish, Louisiana. 43 men left the river dock before sunrise, armed, mounted, and confident they would return within days with new captives in chains. By the end of that week, the dock would receive far fewer riders than it had sent out, and the men who did return would refuse to speak of what they saw beyond the Cypress line. The official ledger from that season records a labor acquisition expedition. No mention of violence, no mention of resistance, just numbers: 43 hunters, 3 wagons, 2 translators, enough rope and iron to restrain over 100 people. At the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, settlements were thin and scattered. Some were known to harbor escaped slaves, others were simply too remote to monitor closely. Plantation owners in the parish had grown impatient. Cotton yields were rising, labor was not. The 43 men were not soldiers. They were contractors, overseers, former militia members, and a handful of professional slave catchers who moved between counties for payment. Most were local. A few had families waiting at home, church-going men, businessmen, fathers. Their leader, Thomas Hale, was 41 years old, methodical, educated enough to keep careful notes. He had organized similar expeditions before, though none this large. The group believed they were headed toward an isolated settlement rumored to shelter runaways. Word had come from a trader who claimed to have passed through weeks earlier. He described a village hidden in marshland, occupied by former slaves and possibly sympathetic freedmen. The rumor carried one important detail: the village had grown bold. They were said to be recruiting others. That detail alone was enough. The hunters traveled southwest by horseback, skirting known bayous before turning into denser swamp terrain. The translators they brought were Creole men familiar with French and local dialects. According to Hale's journal, the plan was straightforward: approach quietly, surround the settlement, seize all able-bodied individuals, burn what remained. On June 5th, just after dusk, they saw the first signs of habitation: smoke rising low through trees, faint lantern light. The swamp opened slightly into a clearing ringed with rough cabins and lean-tos built from driftwood and scrap timber. It looked smaller than expected. A scout reported fewer than 30 visible figures: women, a few children, no visible armed men. Hale made the decision to wait until morning. He believed surprise would ensure compliance. What none of them knew was that the village had seen them first. The Atchafalaya Basin carries sound differently at night. Hoofbeats echo over shallow water, metal brushes against leather. The residents of the settlement were not unfamiliar with pursuit. Many had fled from plantations. Some had survived prior raids. They understood patterns. They recognized preparation. The next morning, June 6th, just after sunrise, the hunters moved in formation. Hale recorded that the village appeared unusually still. No cooking fires, no livestock movement, doors closed. They assumed fear. At 6:12 a.m. the first shot was fired, not by the hunters. It came from the tree line behind them. One rider fell immediately. Confusion spread before formation could adjust. More gunfire followed, measured and staggered, as if from multiple positions. Horses panicked. 2 wagons overturned in soft ground. Within minutes, the hunters realized they were not surrounding a village. They were inside a perimeter. The cabins were empty. Hale's journal ends mid-sentence. The remaining pages were found waterlogged weeks later. Survivor accounts, taken separately and inconsistently, describe the same sequence. The visible settlement had been bait. The real defenders were concealed in the swamp, elevated in cypress trees and behind earthen mounds constructed along narrow approach paths. Escape routes had been mapped. Mud pits had been disguised with brush. By 6:20 a.m. at least 11 hunters were down, some wounded, some dead. The translators fled early and were not seen again. The defenders did not charge. They maintained distance, shot, relocated, and shot again. For the first time in recorded parish history, an organized slave-catching expedition had been tactically outmaneuvered. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. What followed was not a massacre, but a retreat. Hale attempted to regroup his remaining men toward the eastern trail. That path had been narrowed overnight with felled branches. Movement slowed. Gunfire resumed from the flanks. Several hunters attempted to push through the village center, believing it offered clearer ground. Instead, concealed trenches caused additional falls. One account describes sharpened stakes embedded at shallow angles, positioned to maim rather than kill. By mid-morning, the hunters' ammunition began to thin. They had expected compliance, not prolonged engagement. At approximately 9:00 a.m., the firing stopped. Silence in the swamp is not absence, it is waiting. When no further shots came, a handful of hunters gathered the injured and began a cautious withdrawal along the least obstructed path. They did not pursue the defenders. They did not attempt to reclaim bodies left behind. Of the original 43, 29 made it back to Iberville Parish over the next 2 days. Several arrived alone. Others traveled in pairs. 4 were severely wounded. 10 were unaccounted for. A local search party attempted to retrieve the missing men the following week. They found only abandoned equipment and shallow graves marked without names. No bodies were exhumed. Officially, the parish declared 14 men dead. The investigation that followed was brief and largely administrative. Plantation owners demanded retaliation. The sheriff, however, faced a complication. The settlement had vanished. When deputies returned to the clearing, the cabins were dismantled. Ash remained from controlled burns. Tracks led in multiple directions, dissolving into waterlogged terrain. The village had relocated. Witnesses from neighboring areas claimed small groups of former slaves had passed through days earlier, moving deliberately, carrying supplies but leaving minimal trace. They were organized. They were not scattered. The theory most accepted among parish officials was that the settlement had been preparing for months. Scouts likely monitored river traffic. Informants may have overheard plans in town. Defensive structures were not built overnight. The contradiction lay in the hunters' confidence. They believed they were dealing with fugitives hiding in fear. Instead, they encountered a coordinated defensive network. There is no confirmed record of who led the village. Some testimonies mention a former field hand known only as Isaiah. Others speak of a woman referred to as Marie Claire who organized supply movement and evacuation routes. None were captured. The surviving hunters gave statements that minimized tactical details. Pride and reputation were at stake. A few insisted they had been ambushed unfairly. Others admitted they had underestimated the settlement entirely. Thomas Hale's body was never recovered. By late summer of 1847, plantation patrols in Iberville Parish decreased in size. Expeditions moved in smaller groups. Routes became less predictable. The economic demand for labor did not diminish, but caution replaced arrogance. The Trap Village, as it came to be called quietly among traders, entered regional rumor rather than official documentation. A settlement that appeared vulnerable. A clearing that invited entry, a perimeter that closed only after the hunters stepped inside. No formal charges were ever filed, no names recorded among the defenders. No retaliation expedition matched the size of the original 43. The unanswered question remains whether the village was singular or part of a larger network operating across the basin. Evidence suggests communication between settlements, but proof was never established. What is documented is simple. 43 hunters rode into the swamp, believing they were pursuing prey. They entered a controlled battlefield instead. 14 never returned. And somewhere beyond the shifting water and cypress trees, a community that had once been hunted proved it could plan, adapt, and disappear without leaving a trace. The parish records closed the matter by autumn of 1847, but unease did not fade with the paperwork. In the months that followed, plantation owners along the Atchafalaya reported subtle, coordinated disruptions, tools misplaced in predictable patterns, livestock gates opened without theft, river skiffs untied and allowed to drift just far enough to delay transport. None of it violent, none of it openly traceable, but deliberate. Surviving members of the 43 were quieter than before. Several refused further expeditions into deep marshland. One, Samuel Rourke, relocated to Baton Rouge before winter. Another, Elias Turner, resigned his overseer position entirely. Parish correspondence hints at morale complications, though no one used the word fear. The sheriff attempted to rebuild confidence through controlled patrols along the basin's outer edges. These groups reported no direct engagement, but they noted something else: signals. Strips of cloth tied high in trees, carved notches at knee level on cypress trunks, arrangements of stones near shallow crossings. At first glance, they appeared random. Over time, deputies realized they marked safe passages through unstable ground. Someone was mapping the swamp with precision. In early January 1848, a trapper named Lucien Boudreau provided sworn testimony that he had encountered a relocated settlement deeper south, beyond conventional patrol routes. He described cabins built on raised platforms above seasonal flood lines. He claimed to have seen watch posts constructed from woven reeds, nearly invisible at a distance. When asked how many people lived there, Boudreau answered carefully, "Enough." He was unable or unwilling to provide coordinates. The parish attempted a discreet verification mission with 12 armed men. They found nothing except recently disturbed earth and the remnants of cooking pits still warm beneath ash. The settlement had moved again. This pattern repeated twice over the next year. The theory of a single trap village began to erode. Investigators slowly considered a broader possibility: a mobile network of self-sustaining communities communicating through coded markers and river routes. They did not remain fixed long enough to be surrounded. They avoided confrontation unless cornered. When forced, they controlled terrain. In the spring of 1848, a confiscated notebook surfaced from a trader arrested for unrelated charges. Inside were names, first names only, alongside supply tallies: salt, dried fish, powder, cloth. No destinations listed, no signatures, just initials. One set of initials appeared repeatedly: MC. The sheriff compared it against previous witness statements. Marie Claire had been mentioned once, almost casually, by a wounded hunter describing a woman shouting instructions in French during the June ambush. There was no proof the initials referred to the same person. But the pattern suggested leadership existed beyond a single defensive encounter. Meanwhile, economic pressures mounted. Plantation owners argued that hesitation in retrieval efforts emboldened fugitives. Insurance claims related to lost property increased. Parish meetings grew tense. The memory of the 43 hung unspoken in the room whenever new expeditions were proposed. No group that size ever assembled again. In late 1849, a former hunter named Daniel Keene gave a private account to a traveling journalist. It was never formally published, but fragments survived in correspondence. Keene described something investigators had not documented. He claimed that during the initial ambush, he saw children among the defenders, not fighting but observing from elevated platforms. They were being taught, he wrote, shown how to disappear. Keene insisted the village was not improvising defense. It was training for permanence. By 1850, patrol routes had shifted toward easier terrain. The basin interior was informally considered hostile ground. Traders moved along alternative waterways. Word spread quietly among slave catchers operating in neighboring parishes. The swamp held communities that did not behave like fugitives. They behaved like settlers protecting territory. Yet no formal military action was authorized. The region's instability and difficult terrain made large-scale pursuit impractical. The cost outweighed the perceived benefit. Records show a gradual administrative decision to focus elsewhere. As years passed, references to the trap village became anecdotal. Younger deputies dismissed it as exaggeration. Older men avoided the subject. There are no census records of those settlements, no preserved maps marking their locations. Seasonal floods altered landscapes, storms erased footpaths, nature assisted concealment. What remains are fragments. 14 confirmed dead from the original expedition, unrecovered bodies, a leader whose journal ended mid-line, initials repeated in supply ledgers, signals in trees that vanished as bark thickened. In 1863, during the Civil War, Union scouts navigating portions of the basin recorded encounters with established communities of formerly enslaved families living in structured compounds, some claiming to have occupied the region for over 15 years. That timeline traces back directly to 1847. No direct connection was documented, but the dates align. If the trap village was the beginning of a network, it succeeded not through spectacle but through discipline. It avoided open warfare. It relocated when necessary. It taught its children roots, codes, and caution. The 43 hunters set out believing control belonged to whoever carried the most rifles. They learned too late that terrain and preparation can shift power quietly. The swamp kept its own records, unwritten but enduring. And somewhere beneath layers of water, silt, and roots, the exact ground where the perimeter closed around those 43 men remains unmarked. By 1852, the language surrounding the basin had shifted in official correspondence. Where early reports once described fugitive concentrations, later documents used quieter terms: unregulated settlements, self-sustained enclaves, unrecoverable zones. The change was subtle but revealing. The parish no longer assumed temporary flight. It acknowledged permanence. Plantation inventories from Iberville and neighboring parishes reflected another quiet adjustment. Loss projections were recalculated not with expectation of retrieval, but with acceptance of absence. Account books began listing certain individuals as removed to unknown territory, a phrase that carried no recovery plan. Former members of the 43 aged into reluctant witnesses. In 1853, Samuel Work, who had relocated years earlier, provided a deposition in a civil dispute unrelated to the swamp. During questioning about prior employment, he referenced the expedition. When pressed for detail, he responded with a measured statement: "We entered land that had already decided we did not belong." That phrasing appears nowhere else in the record. Meanwhile, river commerce adapted. Traders learned which inlets to avoid after dusk. Some reported silent observation from tree lines while navigating narrow channels. No aggression followed, but the presence was unmistakable. The swamp was no longer considered empty between settlements. It was inhabited by intention. In 1854, a small militia unit from a neighboring parish attempted an exploratory sweep of deeper basin territory. Unlike the original 43, this group advanced cautiously, sending scouts ahead and avoiding centralized clearings. They encountered abandoned cooking sites, woven fish traps placed in optimal currents, and elevated storage platforms constructed with long-term design in mind. They did not encounter residents. Their report concluded with a practical assessment: communities exist beyond our reach. Engagement would require sustained occupation and supply lines not presently feasible. The cost of control outweighed its value. Fragments of oral history collected decades later from formerly enslaved families in southern Louisiana describe an early defensive stand in the late 1840s. The details vary, but recurring elements appear. A false clearing, concealed positions in cypress trees, trenches masked with brush, coordinated withdrawal after engagement. Some accounts credit a former carpenter for designing the perimeter. Others mention a woman fluent in French and English, who negotiated trade for salt and powder through intermediaries. Names remain inconsistent. Leadership appears shared. What is consistent is preparation. The network, if it can be called that, operated without central proclamation. Settlements communicated through coded markers and river patterns. Movement was seasonal, often aligned with flood cycles. Structures were designed for disassembly within hours. Children were trained to read terrain before they could read text. In 1856, a merchant vessel reported a brief exchange at a remote bank where two men approached under a white cloth signal. They requested trade for dried corn and offered cured fish in return. The exchange was conducted without hostility. The merchant later testified that the men declined conversation about origin or numbers. "We are where we need to be," one reportedly said. The phrase entered no official investigation. As the nation edged closer to war, attention shifted away from fugitive recovery toward larger political fracture. The basin settlements, once viewed as targets, became peripheral concerns amid national crisis. When Union forces moved through parts of Louisiana in the early 1860s, they documented organized communities in swamp interiors that displayed agricultural coordination, defensive watch systems, and stable family units. Some of these communities assisted Union scouts with navigation. Others remained neutral, prioritizing concealment over allegiance. No Union report references the original 43 directly, but the timeline aligns with a generation that would have grown from the aftermath of that ambush. Thomas Hale's name faded from plantation ledgers. His family relocated west. The waterlogged journal recovered in 1847 remains archived, its final ink strokes trailing into illegibility. Forensic examination years later suggested the page had been exposed to prolonged moisture before drying, implying it lay on open ground for some time before retrieval. The exact sequence of Hale's final moments remains unknown. Of the 14 confirmed dead, only 5 received marked graves. The remaining 9 were memorialized symbolically, their bodies unrecovered. Parish records attribute their loss to hostile conditions and unknown assailants. No charges were filed. No bounty was successfully placed. No retaliatory expedition matched the scale or ambition of the first. By 1865, with the Civil War concluded and slavery formally abolished, the legal foundation that justified the original expedition no longer existed. The basin settlements, once pursued as property theft, became part of a different historical narrative, communities that had asserted autonomy before it was legally recognized. Yet documentation remains fragmented. The swamp preserved anonymity better than paper. Modern surveys of the Atchafalaya Basin occasionally uncover remnants of raised foundations, rusted metal fragments, and hand-shaped timber joints inconsistent with plantation architecture. Archaeologists classify them as maroon settlement remains, independent communities formed by escaped slaves. Precise dating is difficult due to seasonal flooding and sediment displacement. No site has been conclusively identified as the original trap village clearing. Perhaps it no longer exists in physical form. Flood cycles reshape ground, cypress roots displace markers, mud reclaims trenches. What endures is pattern. 43 hunters rode into unfamiliar terrain expecting submission. They encountered strategy instead, a settlement that anticipated their arrival, a perimeter designed to close only after entry, a community prepared not only to resist, but to relocate and continue. The outcome did not alter national policy in 1847. It did not appear in major newspapers. It did not generate formal inquiry beyond parish limits. But within the basin, behavior changed. Patrol sizes decreased, routes shifted, language softened from certainty to caution. And somewhere in the layered sediment of Louisiana's swamp, beneath water that rises and falls without memory, lies the unmarked ground where confidence gave way to calculation, and where a hunted community proved it understood the terrain better than those who came to claim it. In the years after the war, when federal officials began collecting testimonies from formerly enslaved people across Louisiana, a few interviews taken in remote parishes contained careful references to the stand in the swamp. The phrasing was consistent, but the details were restrained. Those who spoke of it did so without bravado. It was described not as a victory, but as a necessity. One testimony from 1872, recorded near St. Martin Parish, mentioned a night when word arrived that a large mounted party had departed from Iberville with chains and wagons. According to the account, runners were dispatched immediately. Horn signals were not used. Instead, coded knocks were carried along tree trunks at prearranged intervals, a method less likely to travel beyond the basin's natural barriers. The settlement at the clearing was never meant to be permanent. It was constructed with visibility in mind. Smoke was allowed to rise during daylight. Paths were left partially exposed. Livestock noise was permitted. It was designed to be seen. The real structures stood further south, beyond a narrow corridor of stable ground. Trenches had been dug weeks earlier under the supervision of a former field laborer who had once repaired drainage ditches on a plantation. He understood soil weight and water flow. Sharpened stakes were carved not to kill instantly, but to disable horses and slow advance. The goal, according to that testimony, was never annihilation. It was deterrence. A separate account collected in 1881 from a woman identified only as C. Baptiste described a council meeting held days before the ambush. She recalled that some argued for evacuation without confrontation. Others insisted that flight alone would invite larger pursuit. The decision, she said, was to demonstrate cost. There is no record of how many defenders participated. Estimates range between 25 and 40 individuals rotating positions along the perimeter. Firearms were limited and ammunition scarce. Shots were timed deliberately to create the illusion of greater numbers. After the hunters withdrew, the council ordered immediate dismantling of the visible village. Structures were burned from within to eliminate reuse. Supplies were distributed across 3 separate migration routes. Graves for fallen defenders, if any occurred, were unmarked and dispersed. One detail appears repeatedly in oral histories: silence after withdrawal, no celebration, no pursuit. The defenders were instructed to avoid retaliation. Their objective had been achieved once the hunters chose retreat. In Iberville Parish, that retreat carried psychological weight far beyond the casualty count. Letters between plantation owners reveal a shift from aggressive language to guarded phrasing. One letter dated September 1847 states, "The basin is no longer an open matter." The sheriff who oversaw the initial inquiry resigned in 1850, officially for health reasons. Unofficially, correspondence suggests pressure from landowners dissatisfied with the lack of decisive retaliation. His successor prioritized patrols along roadways rather than interior marshland. As Reconstruction unfolded, some former hunters attempted to reframe the event in private memoirs. One manuscript, never formally published but preserved in fragments, described the ambush as an unfortunate miscalculation against organized thieves. Yet even in that defensive language, the writer acknowledged preparation that rivaled military planning. By the late 19th century, children of those basin communities integrated gradually into nearby towns, some purchasing small plots of land, others working river trade. Few publicly connected their origins to the stand in 1847. The swamp had protected them. Public memory could endanger them. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 20th century identified clusters of raised post holes and charcoal layers consistent with rapid structural dismantling. Carbon dating places some of these sites within a decade of the original expedition. None provide definitive proof of the trap village clearing, but they confirm sustained habitation deep within the basin during that era. Modern historians studying maroon communities note that mobility was their greatest defense. Fixed settlements were vulnerable. Mobile networks, coordinated through environmental literacy and coded communication, were nearly impossible to eliminate without sustained occupation. The 43 hunters encountered not a desperate cluster of fugitives, but an early example of that mobility strategy fully realized. Thomas Hale's unfinished journal remains the only written account from inside the hunters' formation. Its final legible words, recovered through restoration, read, "They are not where we expected." The sentence breaks there. No punctuation, no conclusion. Perhaps that fragment captures the entire miscalculation. The hunters expected fear. They encountered foresight. They expected disorder. They encountered structure. 14 graves were recorded in parish documents. Countless lives beyond that clearing continued unrecorded, sustained by discipline and terrain. Today, the Atchafalaya Basin still shifts with seasonal flood. Trails disappear. Ground once firm becomes waterlogged. The landscape resists permanence. It rewards those who understand it. Somewhere within its layered silt lies the unmarked boundary where 43 mounted men crossed into a perimeter they did not recognize until it closed around them. No monument marks the site. No plaque names the defenders. The event survives only in scattered records, oral testimony, and altered behavior that followed. A single expedition intended to capture human beings, instead, revealed a community capable of planning, restraint, and coordinated defense. The swamp kept their names, and the perimeter, once drawn in mud and shadow, dissolved back into water, leaving behind only a lesson recorded in silence. By the turn of the 20th century, the story had thinned into rumor. Local fishermen spoke of an old clearing that was never empty, even when it looked it. Timber workers claimed that certain sections of the basin felt watched, though no figures were seen. Older residents in Iberville would occasionally reference the 43, but rarely in detail, and never in front of outsiders. What remained was behavioral memory. Plantation patrols, long after emancipation, rendered their original purpose obsolete, continued to avoid specific interior routes. Maps printed in the 1890s still left portions of the basin vaguely outlined, marked with minimal survey detail. Engineers cited flooding and unstable ground as justification. But private correspondence between surveyors suggests something more practical. The terrain had a history of organized resistance, and occupation there required more than topographic skill. In 1904, during a timber expansion project, workers uncovered a line of decayed wooden stakes beneath layered sediment. The formation was too linear to be natural, too shallow to be fencing. The site was documented briefly, then reburied as logging operations shifted north. No formal excavation followed. Decades later, in the 1930s, a Works Progress Administration interviewer recorded testimony from an elderly man named Josiah Landry, born in 1855 to parents who had lived in the basin settlements. Landry spoke carefully, pausing often. He described being taught as a child how to read broken reeds as directional markers, and how to step in existing footprints to avoid leaving traceable paths. When asked why such caution was necessary after slavery had ended, Landry responded, "Because freedom does not stop people from coming." He did not elaborate. The interviewer noted that Landry's parents rarely discussed the stand, but when they did, it was framed as instruction rather than legend. They emphasized preparation, silence, and restraint. No celebration was ever described. The lesson passed down was not pride in defeating pursuers, but understanding that survival required anticipation. By mid-century, industrial projects altered portions of the Atchafalaya Basin. Levees redirected flow. Channels were dredged. Some potential archaeological sites were submerged permanently. Others were exposed briefly before erosion reclaimed them. In 1961, a regional historian reviewing parish death ledgers noticed the cluster of 14 fatalities recorded in June 1847 under similar cause descriptions. Fatal encounter during labor expedition. The absence of detailed narrative drew attention. Further inquiry uncovered Hale's fragmented journal, preserved in county archives but rarely examined. The historian attempted to correlate oral accounts with the ledger entries. The parallels were striking, but documentary gaps prevented definitive reconstruction. Without names of defenders or a fixed location, the event remained partially obscured. Academic interest in Maroon communities grew in the late 20th century. Scholars studying resistance networks across the American South identified the basin settlements as part of a broader pattern: mobile, terrain-adapted enclaves that resisted capture through environmental mastery rather than direct confrontation. The Trap Village ambush fit that model precisely. Yet no excavation has conclusively identified the clearing where the 43 entered the perimeter. Seasonal floods rearrange evidence annually. Organic materials decay rapidly. The swamp protects its own history. The most enduring trace may not be physical at all. Correspondence from slave-catching operations in neighboring states after 1847 shows subtle shifts in language. Increased emphasis on reconnaissance, smaller pursuit teams, avoidance of deep wetland incursions without military support. While no document explicitly cites the Iberville expedition as cause, the timing aligns closely. Behavior changed because risk had been demonstrated. The 43 rode out under the assumption that terrain was neutral and resistance scattered. They did not anticipate coordinated defense engineered by those they sought to control. They expected compliance shaped by fear. Instead, they encountered strategy shaped by patience. The defenders' success did not rely on overwhelming force. It relied on information, knowing departure dates, understanding approach routes, predicting formation patterns. Someone had listened carefully. Someone had observed long before the hunters crossed into the basin. That element remains the most unresolved. How early did the settlement know? Who carried word from the docks? Was the expedition compromised before it even left Iberville? No surviving document answers those questions. What is known is outcome. 14 hunters confirmed dead, 9 bodies unrecovered, a leader's journal cut short mid-observation, a parish that quietly recalculated its reach, and a network of communities that persisted long enough for a new generation to be born beyond the shadow of pursuit. Today, the Atchafalaya Basin continues to shift, water rising, land dissolving, boundaries redrawn by current rather than decree. Visitors see cypress trees, slow channels, and quiet marsh. There is no marker indicating where a perimeter once closed around 43 mounted men. But history does not require monuments to endure. Sometimes it survives in altered behavior, in routes avoided, in caution inherited without full explanation. The Trap Village was never formally mapped. Its defenders were never formally named. Its strategy was never formally studied in its own time. Yet the lesson it delivered was recorded clearly enough to change conduct. Enter unfamiliar ground without understanding it, and the ground may already be arranged against you. The swamp absorbed the clearing, the water erased the trenches, the stakes decayed. But the calculation, the quiet decision to prepare rather than panic, remains embedded in the record of what followed. And the final line of Thomas Hale's journal still ends mid-thought, a sentence suspended in ink, capturing the exact moment certainty gave way to realization. In the end, the record closes the way it began, quietly. No formal battle report, no official retaliation campaign, no public acknowledgement that 43 armed men had ridden into the basin and been methodically outmaneuvered. By 1870, the names of the 14 dead appeared only in aging ledgers, their cause of death reduced to a line of ink. Families moved on. Land changed hands. New conflicts overtook old ones. The Civil War, Reconstruction, industrial expansion, each wave of history layered over the last, pressing the memory of the basin deeper into obscurity. But absence of recognition does not erase consequence. After 1847, large-scale slave-catching expeditions into deep Louisiana wetlands effectively ceased. Smaller patrols remained near plantations and main roads. But the interior marshland was treated as operationally unstable, not officially forbidden, just avoided. The shift was never announced. It simply happened. The communities within the basin did not declare victory. They did not expand aggressively or attempt visible control of territory. They continued as they had planned, mobile when necessary, concealed when prudent, structured always. They taught their children routes through shallow water and how to listen for distant hooves before sunrise. When emancipation arrived nearly 2 decades later, many of those communities had already lived in practical autonomy. Legal freedom altered their status in law, but not their daily discipline. They understood land, concealment, and coordination long before legislation confirmed their humanity. No surviving document lists the names of the defenders who stood along the tree line on June 6, 1847. No preserved map shows the exact shape of the perimeter that closed behind the 43. The swamp never offered those details to paper. What remains are fragments. A journal ending mid-sentence. They are not where we expected. A sheriff's resignation letter citing administrative strain. Ledger entries shifting from recovery to loss. Oral histories passed carefully through generations, stripped of embellishment, focused only on preparation and restraint. The trap village was never meant to endure as a place. It was meant to function as a moment, a demonstration that terrain and planning could outweigh numbers and assumption. 14 graves marked, 9 unmarked, and beyond those numbers, an uncounted community that chose to stand once precisely and then disappear on its own terms. Today, the Atchafalaya Basin rises and falls with seasonal flood. Water covers ground that once held cabins built as bait. Cypress roots twist through soil that may still conceal fragments of stake or rusted iron. There is no plaque, no historical marker at a roadside turnout. Visitors see only water, trees, and silence. But silence in this case is not emptiness. It is the residue of calculation. 43 hunters entered the swamp certain of their control. They believed they understood pursuit, dominance, and outcome. They did not understand that information had already moved ahead of them, that a council had debated their arrival, that trenches had been carved in advance, that watch posts had been positioned high in trees, waiting without panic. They crossed into a clearing designed to invite them. And when the perimeter closed, it did so without spectacle. The defenders did not chase. They did not celebrate. They dismantled, dispersed, and returned to water and shadow. History often preserves the names of those who claim power. It less often preserves the names of those who quietly refuse it. The trap village remains unnamed in official archives. But its lesson remains intact. Control assumed is not control secured. Terrain ignored becomes terrain weaponized, and communities forced into the margins may learn to turn those margins into advantage. Somewhere beneath layers of silt and slow-moving current lies the unmarked ground where certainty faltered and calculation prevailed. No monument stands there. Only water,